Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to continue on with our discussion of the Enneagram and the different types and how they can be used in writing as well as just kind of in your personal life. And I don't think last time I discussed this, but most of the information I'm getting from is from this book, The Wisdom of the Enneagram. And as you can see, it's actually quite a thick book. This is I think it's like 500 pages. This is not a light read. Unfortunately, I think it's out of print, so good luck finding it. I found my copy just by luck at Half Price Books here in Austin. But this, just this amount of information tells you that I'm really just scratching the surface when talking about the Enneagram. There's a lot more information than what I have time to go through these videos. And to be honest, I'm not even sure if I understand the full depth that they get into. But this has a really good in-depth view of each of the types. It goes into like what their childhood was like, their views on sex and sexuality, how healthy and unhealthy they can get, things to work on. There's little assessments in here to kind of tell you, how much of a type you particularly are. So if you can find it, it's called The Wisdom of the Enneagram, and I'll put this. Put a link in the, if I can find one, put a link in the description so that way maybe you can find a copy for yourself if you want to read even more. But today what I want to go over is the first type of the Enneagram, type 1, and that is the reformer. The reformers are very involved with a higher ideal. They have a cause that takes on almost like a religious pursuit for them, and a lot of times it is a religious pursuit, and they will follow that ideal to the very farthest thing be. They have a view in how they can make the world better, and if they're not doing that, then they feel useless, and they feel kind of pointless. And what's interesting about them is that they have very high ideals, but they'll also have usually a lot of practical ways of actually trying to get there. So they try and take their ideals and put them into practice, which I think makes them a little different than most of the other types out there. Being very idealized like that, they have this interesting kind of balance, or I guess conundrum in their life. Their ideals are actually very feeling-centered. They are driven by their feelings and their emotions. This feels right, this feels wrong, there's injustice in the world, and I need to fix it. And so they have these feelings, but then they will use logic to back those feelings up. The feeling comes first, and then the logic. So these are the types of people that will excuse what they do because it serves a higher goal. These people live totally by the notion of the ends justify the means. If there's a way to stop injustice in the world, then by any means necessary. I guess that's another one that they use. Another quote that I think is a reformer type quote is, you must destroy the village in order to save the village, which was an actual quote from, I think, the Vietnam War, in which they had to save the village from the enemy, the Viet Cong, and in order to do that, you had to like firebomb it and kill all the people in it. And so, like I said, their logic can be a bit twisted, but it is meant to justify their ideals and their actions to fulfill those ideals. A lot of people will complain about like the social justice warrior concept, and they are typically usually reformer types, which has a lot of other interesting things about. Let's see, they also can be very perfectionistic, meaning that they have this ideal and they should be reaching for that goal. So they can be very perfectionistic, have a very rigid view of themselves and the world and the way they act, and they don't like their more base desires. They're afraid of them. They feel shameful of them. This is also kind of the group, this is a little more of an unhealthy view, the more unhealthy type ones. They're the type that they're like the televangelist who preaches against the sins of homosexuality when he's got a gay lover on the side kind of thing. This is the church lady who sings very loud in the choir and treats people badly because they don't act just the way that she likes, but on the side she's actually embezzling money from the church. That kind of thing. A lot of hypocrisy. These are very unhealthy sort of views. But yeah, they don't like their own base desires. And so by following this sort of idealistic path, they are helping to make up for that. Either they want to hide it from themselves, hide it from others, or at least just compensating for it. It's like, well, yeah, I overindulge in alcohol, but I still pay my tithes to the church, kind of thing. So sometimes they will try and exchange one good act for a bad act in order to kind of make up for it. But some other aspects of them. So their base fear is being corrupt or evil or defective in some ways. They're very afraid of being a bad person, basically. And so their base desire is to be good and to have integrity and to be very balanced in life as well. As a substance abuse counselor, this is something I specialize in, I try to always think of, like, for my clients, from my experience with clients, with whatever type they happen to fit in with, what what substance abuse are they what substance are they most likely to abuse? And from my experience, reformers tend to abuse alcohol more than any of the others. Um, Alcohol is kind of cheap and easy. It's socially acceptable depending on your circles, uh, but it also helps numb them out. This constant feel of being needing to feel perfect and always right and always good and always living up to this high ideal, for unhealthy type ones, this is kind of crippling. It's also just exhausting. And so for a lot of them, I think just drinking helps them just sort of numb out that feeling of stress and anxiety that they always have to be perfect, that sort of thing. Mind you, they're more likely to do it in secret. So they'll be raging alcoholics, but they will do it at home, and you'll probably never know it. You'll be quite surprised as to who the type 1 alcoholics are, is because they know that it's bad and they don't want anyone else to know about it. They don't want to admit it to themselves. Um, let's see. So talking about type 1s from an extreme view to unhealthy to average to healthy, just to kind of give you an idea of, like, where type 1s come from. I also want to do it in this viewpoint too, because as writers, we typically want to have a character growth. We want to talk about character arc. Well, they need to go somewhere. So if your character is already at the healthy stage, there's no real way for them to go. Unless you want to have them at a healthy stage and then knock them down to unhealthy so that way they grow back to being healthy. That's actually good art. But for character growth when you write, that's how you have to go. And just by following a path from unhealthy to healthy, then the character arc basically just writes itself right there. All you have to do is think about in what context is this character going to get from point A to point B. And that right there can be a whole story. So that's all I want to talk about. I'm also including the extreme. Extreme means, like, people who are very, very unhealthy. Like, a lot of my clients would fit more into the extreme or maybe unhealthy categories, because their issues are so bad now that they're actually probably not functioning very well in society. And so now they need professional help in some ways, if they'll look for it. So with extreme type 1, they can have obsessive compulsive disorder. As you can imagine, OCD drives people to want to act in just the right way. People with OCD, a lot of times they act or think or do things in ways to prevent something bad. And it's almost like a superstition taken to the extreme. You know, if I don't pull my ear 3 times in a row every time I see a red car, then something bad will happen. I don't know what bad is, but it'll be horrible, and it'll be my fault because I didn't pull my ear 3 times when I saw a red car. That's the kind of logic that can go into an OCD. It's a little bit of a ridiculous example, but lots of other examples like that. And it becomes this compulsion that they have to do, and the anxiety of needing to do this all the time and being constantly vigilant, and that constant pressure that if I don't act in just the right way, something horrible is going to happen. And sometimes the horribleness is just that vague. It's just something bad will happen. Sometimes it's more specific. If I don't do this 3 times, then my mother will die. And again, they'll use crazy logic to justify these emotions. So when I'm saying it, it sounds silly, but when someone's actually living that life, it makes perfect sense, and they can't get out of it. They're kind of trapped in that moment. The other example is eating disorders. People with eating disorders, particularly anorexia and bulimia, they have highly perfectionistic views of themselves and the way they're supposed to act and the way they're supposed to be. And controlling their food, this is more for, especially for anorexics, controlling their food is a way of also trying to reach that view of perfection. Anorexia can start off as a way to become pretty. It can become about appearances, but especially at the more extreme levels, it can morph into I have to be perfect, I have to be good, I have to be the best, and for some reason, restricting food becomes a part of that. Again, not really logical, all feeling, but the feelings can be justified. Also it can be a lot of crippling guilt, a lot of self-punishment. These can also be the people who will self-harm because they think that they're bad, and by self-harming, they make up for it. In the Middle Ages, I think actually the character in Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, there was like this albino monk, and he would whip himself. The Order of Opus Dei has these little whips that they beat themselves with and that sort of thing. That is also an aspect of extreme type 1. Is the ideal is being the perfect Christian. But you won't reach that ideal because you have these base desires because you're just a flawed human. And so by beating yourself, you whip the sin out of yourself or something like that. Again, very extreme, luckily very rare, but this is, aspects of these kind of characters. At the unhealthy level, they can be moral hypocrites. They will say one thing and do another thing, like the televangelist who preaches against homosexuality, but he's got a gay lover on the side. They can become very repressive as well. They are repressed themselves, but then they will become repressive of others. They have an ideal view of how the world should be, and by God, you're going to follow through with it as well. So these are the ones who will punish people who don't dress the right way, who don't look the right way, who don't act the right way, who they think is behaving in some kind of sinful manner, quote-unquote sinful. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious viewpoint. This could be someone who kind of getting in the social justice warrior mentality. This is someone who doesn't acknowledges their privileges before they say anything else. That is like a sin because you should acknowledge your privileges because that is a guilt that you should be carrying with you. So this is sort of the unhealthy types. It's not necessarily religious, but can feel religious if you really break it down and think about it. They can be very self-righteous, very closed-minded, hateful towards others. These are the types those are good, those are bad, and those are good. And you avoid the bad. They otherize very much people. In that sense, you could say that the Nazis, at least some of the Nazis in World War I, were trying to purge the Jews because they really thought the Jews were evil and nasty and need to be gotten rid of. And so this is taking type 1 to a very far extreme. In that sense, unhealthy type 1s can make very interesting villains in stories because they can be the ones that, the witch hunter who's trying to kill all the witches, the vampire hunter, if your protagonist is a vampire, the vampire hunters are the ones who are trying to attack them all the time. Or it could just be, the mean church lady at a small town who doesn't like the poor kids who live over in the trailer park because they must be nasty because they're poor, right? That sort of thing. So average type 1s, they have a feeling that they must stick to very strict principles. They can be very perfectionistic and opinionated, and they want others to share in their viewpoint, but they're usually not as bad as unhealthy ones. So they might be the ones who preach a lot, but they're actually trying to live up to those ideals. So this would be the minister who preaches against gay marriage and homosexuality, but he doesn't have a gay lover. He's not necessarily a hypocrite, but he has this view of this is what Christianity should be like, this is what a good life is, and he will then pursue that further on down the lines to the point of starting petitions to prevent other people from getting married, or the sort of person who thinks rock and roll is evil and so they're trying to get rid of rock and roll, or someone who is constantly pushing some sort of social justice agenda. Though they don't necessarily want to shut down this one group, they definitely want to see this one get elevated more so, maybe even to the detriment of the others, that sort of thing. A lot of type 1s are usually in the average range. As you can imagine, average means that's where most people are. Type 1s can be the ones who will be very eager to tell you ways in which you're wrong. I think in another way, like a lot of people joke about, like, was it, vegans or keto diet, or people who are in CrossFit. The sort of jokes and the memes about that is like, how do you know someone is a vegan? You just wait for them to tell you, kind of thing. For them, this sort of kind of comes off as a religious pursuit as well, and they will totally tell you, they can totally back up why it is better for you to be a vegan, or to do CrossFit, or to lose weight, or follow some fad diet, or whatever there is, because they honestly believe it's what's best, and they think it's what's best for you, and by God, they're going to tell you about it. But once type 1s get to be healthy, they can be like real heroes. At that point, they understand they have a high ideal. They understand they're probably not going to reach it, so perfectionism isn't no longer necessary. They understand they're just human, and they have their base desires, and they know that they're flawed, but they're working past that. They've kind of come to accept these issues. They want to help others, but they do it without judgment. They do it without oppressing people, or without seeming too preachy or anything else like that. As far as examples, looking at like examples in the real world, almost anyone who you can think of as being a proponent for social change, like Mahatma Gandhi, is a good example. I think Martin Luther King fits in this well. I think even like President Jimmy Carter, a lot of people don't know that he's or former President Jimmy Carter, he's a born-again Southern Baptist. And when we talk about born-again Southern Baptist, we think, oh, this is someone who hates drinking and smoking and doesn't like certain kinds of people and stuff. And whereas it's true that when he was in the White House, it was a dry White House, like he didn't allow alcohol in the White House. They still had the dances and things. He's 90 some odd years old, and still has survived brain cancer, and he still works with Habitat for Humanity, building houses and that sort of thing. So he's very much has these Christian ideals, and he's trying to live up to them, and he understands that it's not his job to push other people to live up to his ideals. It's his job to live up to his ideals. And so that's a very good example of a healthy type 1. And then another one is Sir Thomas More. I don't think we know as much about him in the States. When I grew up a Catholic, it was St. Thomas More, which was the church that I went to. He was the bishop during the time of King Henry VIII, and Henry VIII wanted to divorce one of his wives, and Thomas More, who I think was like the archbishop or something like that, wouldn't let him because he said it went against the church's teachings, even though they'd actually been good friends growing up. And Henry VIII put him in prison, took all his money. I think he was eventually executed. But Sir Thomas More had this high ideal of these are the rules that you follow. This is right. This is wrong. You don't abuse the legal system to get what you want, because back then the legal system was very much tied to the Catholic Church and rules. And so he was willing to die for those causes. And so he was another good example of type 1, that he stuck to his guns and wouldn't let anyone go. For more fictional examples, a good kind of villainous, so to speak, is Saturday Night Live's The Church Lady. I think she was back in the 90s, so it's kind of old, But she was very much, sort of a joke, but she was very, very preachy, very judgy, and, any little thing that she could find that was sinful, she happily wanted to tell you, and was, very worried about the influence of Satan in everybody's lives and that sort of thing. As I was looking through this, one of the examples someone gave as a type 1 was Mr. Spock from Star Trek, which I thought was kind of interesting, because I thought he'd be another type, but as I got to think about it, I was like, no, it makes sense. As a Vulcan, he's a type 1, because if you know about Star Trek, Vulcans actually have emotions. They actually have base desires. Um, and long in the past, they actually lived with all those emotions, but it caused a big civil war, caused a lot of rift. And so the Vulcans realized if we start implying pure logic, we can suppress our base desires and things like that. And so it's not that Mr. Spock doesn't have emotions, it's just through very rigid application of logic, he suppresses those emotions. And so he doesn't give in to those base desires. Remember, that's one of the examples of a type 1 reformer. And another good fictional example is Batman. Batman has a very rigid view of justice and how to mete out justice. That's why he doesn't kill. He doesn't believe in killing, but he also believes in going after people who have broken the law and defending the weak. And he has this very high, rigid, ideal view of the world. And it's a pretty much single-minded focus. That's why he never got married. He never had kids. He doesn't really stop. We've even had extensions of Batman to where now he's an old man and he can't really go out and fight anymore, and he hires younger people to kind of do that for him. I think from a Marvel example, now I think about the Punisher is also a type 1. He's just a little unhealthier because to him every crime is a death sentence. At least in the earlier stages of the Punisher. I don't know about so much today, but in the earlier stages, everyone who broke any amount of law deserve to die because they're all criminals and they all deserve to die. I think Daredevil is probably another example of a type 1 that he's a little more like a Batman kind of ideals though, that you need to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, and he's a very healthy type 1. Daredevil is, in the sense that he's even willing to kind of skirt the law. Even though he is a lawyer, he's willing to skirt the law a little bit. But there's been cases where he will be the best lawyer he can be to make sure that that person, his defendant, actually gets off, even though maybe he realizes somewhere along the way that they're guilty. So then he'll dress up in his Daredevil costume and go, beat the crap out of him, because he has to be the best superhero he can be. But anyway, I hope that was helpful. This was the Type 1, the Reformers for Enneagram. In the next video, next week, we're going to talk about Type 2, the Helpers, and how they can be useful as characters in a story. Anyway, thanks for listening. Bye.